Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show podcast. Would you like to start by telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do, please?
So my name's Tom Shakespeare. I'm Professor of Disability Research at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I'm a sociologist, obviously. I trained at Cambridge, and my current role is really doing process evaluations of interventions to improve the lives of disabled people in low middle income countries. So it's a lot of disability and development research, but also I do research in the UK, particularly about recently the impact of COVID on disabled people.
Great, thank you. And I had a look on your Wikipedia just as sort of an introduction. I mean, huge number of things that you've done throughout your time, Tom. Very long and varied career, if I do say so myself.
I think I tend to get bored of things, so I tend to move on to different things. I've lived in different places. I feel that all of my work is broadly about disability. I've worked for the World Health Organization, and I think it's exciting to be a sociologist because you're looking at the world around you, trying to make sense of it and trying to make it better. And in my case, that's particularly in the field of disability.
Thank you, Tom. And we'll start with that disability then. So the first thing I wanted to ask you, which on the base of it sounds like a simple question, but maybe it isn't. And that's, how do you define what a disability is?
Well, as you say, that was my entire PhD. What the hell is a disability? So I think that there is a evolved human functioning, and disability is a negative departure from that. However, everybody has a departure from how you could be, and therefore we always need to look at both disability and context. So what are we expecting people to do in our society at this time, and also to look at cultural values behind what is disability and what is not. For example, if I lacked the lowest digit of my hand, that wouldn't really be a disability to somebody who is working in academia. But if I was a concert pianist, it'd be a huge disability. I couldn't be a concert pianist. In the case of a comedian, Dave Allen, he literally lacked the lowest knuckle of his left hand. He made a joke out of it. He was a comedian, didn't matter at all. But in other areas, it might have mattered. And so it shows that what we think of as a disability is very cultural, very defined by your context. And for example, there's a lot of attention at the moment to neurodiversity. And we realize that many people are neurodivergent. And of course, that mental difference may manifest in different ways. It may be among people who make millions on the stock exchange or for their business, or it may be people who are turn to a life of crime and end up in prison, but are very rule-breaking and risk-taking in their criminal career, as it were. So our cultural values say really whether disability is positive or negative a lot of the time.
Are you kind of drifting slightly into what we call the social and the medical models there then, in terms of the disability being socially constructed, if you like?
Yes, and not surprisingly, because that's what I know most about. And what happened was that historically, disabled people were defined as people with things wrong with them. They had a deficit of mind or body that explained their social situation. And if you like, this is a case of biological reductionism. And when I say it like that, immediately our hackles go up. We get a bit worried because, of course, slavery, gender subordination, oppression of lesbian gay people, all of it was justified on the basis of biological difference. It's not that we are nasty people, it's merely that they deserve to be subordinate to the master race or whatever it might be. And therefore we should look very carefully at disability and how much is dependent on what we expect people to be and on our narrow range of acceptability and the way that we construct our environments. For example, I went to a college which had never had women before I arrived. And when I arrived with a cohort of women too. And this college was founded in 1347. And one thing it didn't have was women's toilets. And of course, women, generally, they're not unisex toilets. So there had to be installed far more women's toilets. Now, that is a classic case of, because it had not been part of the academic institution, it was not part of the architectural landscape. And the same is the case with disabled people. I use a wheelchair. So when I can't get into a building, is that because it doesn't have accessibility, or is it because I don't have walking as one of my abilities? Now, yeah, you know all about the medical social models. I'm glad of that. But what I want to say is that whereas disability is socially created, there are lots of, like I gave you the example of the building, lots of examples of that. There is also an intrinsic biological element. So what I want to do is to balance the biological and the social and the cultural and the psychological, for that matter. And I want to say they all go into the makeup of what it takes, what it is to be disabled. And I don't want us to, as it were, forget that we have bodies and that they don't always work as we want them to.
With that in mind, then, how do you, because there's obviously subcategories of disability. So what are those subcategories that we tend to talk about within disability?
Well, we might think about physical impairments, and obviously I was born with a physical impairment. We might think of mental health conditions, and then we're into the whole area of both common mental disorders, as they're called. I wouldn't use that term disorder, but like depression or anxiety, whatever. And then more serious mental illness like schizophrenia, bipolar condition, or personality disorder, which are much more lifelong, if you like. We also talk about learning difficulties, which again come in a range from, obviously you know about Down syndrome and so forth, but this idea is very interesting, that we have an average IQ of 100, and learning disability was defined as 2 standard deviations below average, and that counts as learning disabled. And so, of course, lots of people in society have learning disability of no obvious cause, and they may be captured within that. But you can immediately see how our notions of average, how our notions of standard deviation, I mean, they're the ways that we define this, but they're contingent. They are what we decide to define. And of course, we live, I'm taking this slide of the Trinity College Dublin long room. Look at all these books. We live in a knowledge economy. And of course, that immediately disables people with learning difficulties who can't read or can't retain information. So physical impairment, mental impairment, mental illness, learning difficulties. We also have obviously the whole realm of sensory conditions like deafness and blindness, deafblindness. And again, we might say, well, is it that somebody's deaf, or is it that we don't know sign language and we can't converse with a deaf person in the same way? There's a famous book by my friend Nora Gross called Everyone Here Spoke Sign, which is about Martha's Vineyard, which was an island off Massachusetts. And because it was settled in the Pilgrim Fathers' days by people who had a hereditary form of deafness, they were not the majority, but they were a substantial minority. And so everybody used deaf sign language. And what Nora found when she interviewed old folk from that community was they couldn't really remember who was deaf and who wasn't, because everybody used sign language. And therefore being deaf was not so much for disability. And then I would also add chronic health conditions. So a lot of these are invisible. So there might be MS or diabetes or epilepsy. now, what's quite interesting about all of these conditions, but particularly chronic health conditions, is that we have an objective idea that these people or those people have something which makes them disabled, but subjectively, they may not think of themselves as disabled at all. And of course, half all disabled people over the age of 60 and older people often don't define as disabled at all. They may have functional deficits, but they say, well, this is just normal aging, this is natural. And indeed, when the former Disability Rights Commission did research, they found that 50% of people who had rights under the Disability Discrimination Act, which is what we used to have before the Equality Act, 50% of people who were covered by that act didn't think of themselves as disabled at all. And therefore they changed their strapline. Instead of saying we're, I can't remember what it was, but we support the rights of disabled people, they said we support the rights of people who are covered by the Disability Discrimination Act or something like that. So you didn't have to define as disabled subjectively before you were covered by that protection.
Interesting.
It is.
Yeah. One of the questions a student put to me, and I struggled to answer it, so I thought I'd put it to you, is they asked about, does the impairment need to have some sort of permanence? So for example, if you were in a car accident, you broke your leg, okay, and you're in a cast or even in a wheelchair, but you will return back at some point, does that count as a disability?
Well, according to the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, no, because that convention passed by the UN in 2006 defines disability in terms of long-term condition. Having said that, somebody who is temporarily in a wheelchair or a splint or whatever, or has some other impairment, finds out what it's like pretty quick. They find out that the world is not designed for people who are different. That's one thing. And they may start being seen as dependent. They might start being seen as incapable. And so they get some sense of the stigma involved in disability and the way that people are treated. However, as you say, they're not long-term disabled, so they get out of it. And then hopefully their views are changed. They are more inclusive and less likely to define people as incapable merely because they can't do a thing. And what I can't remember whether I've talked about this before in lectures. I probably have, but we can think about a group of people who don't carry their own money, live in segregated accommodation, don't go to normal schools, are stared at wherever they go, and this would sound like a very stigmatized negative experience, but it would also count as a description of the British royal family. So clearly there is a difference between physical dependency, if you like, and social dependency. You can be physically very dependent on other people and socially very independent. So you can be very powerful, in fact. And in fact, in historical societies, the more that people had things done for them, the more powerful they were. So this is really odd, in a way, that the definition of power is having somebody else wipe your bottom. That's not, the gentleman of the stool, they were called, I believe. That is not what we think of. We think of people being very dependent, but it doesn't have to be like that. And therefore, we should try and, as it were, change those social relations to give people more respect, whether or not they need other people to do things with them or for them or to make their lives better.
Thank you, Tom. You mentioned the word stigma. One of the questions I wanted to put to you was about representations in the media. I just wondered where you thought we were at the moment. There's arguments to say that things have got much better, much improved. But there's also arguments to say that often representations are still very stereotyped and still quite basic. So I was interested to put that question to you, where you thought we were at the moment with that.
I think you're right. I think representations of disability have improved massively over my lifetime. I just had my 57th birthday. And when I do lectures about disability to lay audiences or student audiences or whatever, I have to obviously check my examples, not just because they're all old and people don't understand them, but also because there have been improvements. So, it takes a lot of time to change attitudes. When I was young, gay men were seen as being effeminate and camp and and figures fun. And now, absolutely, there is I think, total acceptance, total inclusion, and a range of good images. So gay people can be lots of different things and can be celebrated for that. Now, that change happened over years. So, as I say, 20 or 30 years ago, Larry Grayson or John Inman or whatever would be being very camp. And now it's nobody really cares and it's accepted. Now, not by everybody, not everywhere, but broadly. And so the change in disability representation is going to take a long time. But we see many more disabled people being actors. We see the story of the disability movement being represented by writers like Jack Thorne or in film. And I don't know, I didn't see it, but this film When Barbara Met Johnny was about Barbara Lasicki and Johnny Schreiner. I know them very well. I used to perform with them. And now they're the subject of a sort of biopic on the BBC. So it's a very odd, for me, who's lived through it, it's a very odd thing to see. But there are more representations. But I also think that we have a body fascism, that now more and more bodies have to be a certain way, and they have to be young, and they have to be capable, and they have to be thin. So our tolerance of difference has reduced. So there is a sort of, disabled people are fine, but everybody is going to have to be much more, and only certain sort of disabled people. A friend of mine, Jan Gruer, in Norway, did a talk about, or an article about representations of disability in Norwegian television. And what he found was that, if you could do outward bound, so you're physically strong, then it didn't matter if you're in a wheelchair. But if you're frail, if you had a fatigue-related impairment, you are not covered. And the same you could say for wonderful representations of the Paralympics. Yes, if you're a winner, that's fine. But a lot of disabled people couldn't possibly do those things. And we want their representation to be changed as well.
So is there still, I know there's been lots of writing about that the representations are either oversimplified or stereotyped or often patronizing, I think is the word that comes up. That's still the case, you would say?
I think there's a greater range. I think disabled people are allowed to be more things. But I mean, historically, disabled people were, as it were, sick and dying, tragic but brave and plucky, and people like Tiny Tim well, I used to call it Dickens' Christmas Carol. I now call it the Muppet Christmas Carol. People might remember that. Or they were actually evil. So I'm sorry about all the Ricardists out there, but Richard III, written by Shakespeare as a hunchback, and even the dogs bark at my passing. But lots of negative, physically deformed characters, James Bond villains, often very physically deformed and so forth. And then thirdly, the sort of supercrip idea. And I think that, like Stephen Hawking, a crippled man, but solving the problems of the universe, or a lot of stereotypes of disabled people are about this sort of supercrip idea. Now, what's wonderful now is that people are just able to be human, just able to be interesting, boring, bad, good, sexy, unsexy, the range, like other human beings. And that's what disabled people want. They want that range of stereotype, that they don't want to suddenly flip from being always useless to being always powerful. They want to go, yeah, I'm good at some things, I'm bad at other things. Yeah, what day is it?
So almost it shouldn't be the central sort of narrative of the story. Is that right? Yeah.
Exactly. What some of my American friends call narrative prosthesis, and what they mean is that disability is like a crutch for the writers. So they go, oh, disabled, he'll be struggling to come to terms, or disabled, he'll be bitter and twisted, or disabled, he'll have overcome his limitations and be better than anybody else. And these stereotypes, these one-dimensional plot ideas, make for very shallow film and TV. And if you think about it, these stereotypes of what we used to have with Black folk and Asian folk or gay folk, they are very limited. It's like, no, that's not what we're like. We're ordinary human beings, and we do everything you do. But we're just a little bit different, and that does not explain why we do what we do, or whether we succeed, or what we do.
I probably should have asked you this right at the start, Tom. Are you happy? Because lots of students will have seen your name in a book, but might not be aware of your own disability. So do you mind just outlining?
I've got lots. So first of all, I was born with achondroplasia. Long word. It basically is a genetic condition. My father had it, he's dead now. My children have it, my granddaughter has it. So that's why my arms, I'm spreading out my arms here, but they're not very long. And I've got a slightly different shaped head. So that's what I was born with. In 2008, I became paralyzed. That's partly because, well, that's largely because I have achondroplasia. And so can you hear me whirling around and bashing around in my living room? So I use a wheelchair, I'm paralyzed. So that's an acquired impairment. And thirdly, a little while ago, or a couple of years ago, during lockdown, in fact, I said to my colleague, oh, I don't really understand that, I'm a bit ADHD. And she said, are you really? And I went, yeah, well, I don't know. And she said, well, you should get tested. And so I went and got tested, and I do have ADHD. And in a way, you started this interview by saying, why have you done so many different things? Well, that is classic ADHD behavior. You get bored and you do something else. And you're not very good at sticking at things. And I think that's actually a strength as well as a weakness. I'm not, look at all his books. I'm not necessarily the great scholar who's written 100 books. But I am, feel the breadth is very good.
And on that point, talking about your different books, your different writing, one of my colleagues said you've got to ask him this. I think a colleague of mine saw you talk recently, and she mentioned you were writing or have written something about disability and sex. And she said, you've got to ask Tom about this. So.
Oh, well, I wrote a book a long time ago with Kath Gillespie-Sells, who sadly just died, and Dominic Davis, called The Sexual Politics of Disability. And this is the first book I wrote in, I think, 1996, and we did an update. 20 years later, we talked to people in 2016 and wrote an update, myself and Sarah Richardson. We've just been in a big bid to look at sexual reproductive health for disabled people in Britain. So we're waiting on tenterhooks. You'll put in your funding bid, and sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. So we really want to explore whether disabled people get access to sexuality education, abortion, contraception, pregnancy, diseases, sexual related diseases, all of that screening. We want to know sexual violence. We want to know whether disabled people are included in those provisions. So I am still very interested in sex. And I hope to do more work in that area.
Fantastic. I wondered as well, I was just thinking, just flipping back to the media for a moment, what your interpretation was of programs like Undateables, Love on the Spectrum, and so on. Again, do they fall into the patronizing, the head patting, sort of looking down on? How do you feel about them?
I mean, obviously, one of the, I would say, and I think a lot of disabled people would say, Undateables, what a terrible, terrible title. But I actually did watch one of the programs, and because a friend of mine was doing a voiceover, and I thought, well, actually, this is quite sweet. But as soon as you find yourself going, oh, this is very sweet, as you say, you get into the cute, slightly patronizing, and the question which all disabled people have asked is, why aren't there disabled people on regular programs? Whether it's dating programs or makeover programs or quiz shows or whatever else, why aren't they just there? Because we are part of the population. There are more than a billion disabled people in the world, and we make up about 15% of the population, about 1 in 8 or more of the population. And therefore, why aren't we just there? Why aren't we contestants from time to time? Why aren't we on The Apprentice from time to time? And increasingly we are. So that's really exciting. It's really good. And so we should be. And I think, this picture of the long library and the Book of Kells around the corner, this is Trinity College Dublin Library is the slide I use. Look at those statues. They're all white men, and they're all non-disabled white men. And it could be anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere, really. And we want to change that. We want to say we're not all white men. We are diverse. We're different. We're men and women, and we're defined differently. We're gay and straight, and we define differently. We're disabled and non-disabled, and we define differently. And I think that is how it should be. That's how it is. So let's have TV or magazines or museums that reflect that.
I just wondered, is there a difficult balance? Because quite often, if there is a disabled character in a program, you get some eye rolling, and this is just tokenism, that sort of feeling that they're there just to sort of make up the quota, as you like.
Yeah, yes. And I always wonder whether my career, my success, and I have been quite successful, is explained by my innate qualities, or because they wanted a disabled person and they thought, well, he's bright, he can talk, we'll have him. And I think it's a mixture. Sometimes it is that. It is tokenism. Having said that, even tokenism isn't a complete waste of time. As long as you're not just sitting there silently, not able to contribute, as long as you're pulling your weight, as it were, within the context, then for other disabled people who come after you, for disabled kids, they can see you in public spaces, they can see you in organizations, they can see you on the television or whatever it might be, and they go, you know what, I could do that too. And it is part of moving us towards what we want, which is that nobody cares. That's what we really want. I said earlier that whether you're gay or straight, nobody cares. And that's exactly how it should be in terms of disability. There's what we would call reasonable accommodation. So let's make sure that you can get in the building, that you can use the toilet, that we take account of your difference. And then let's let you get on with it. And let's, let 1,000 flowers bloom or whatever.
I'm glad to hear over your career, Tom. It sounds like that far more positives than negatives. It's not perfect, but we are making huge progress.
I think so. I think there are interesting developments. Like we've had a process of welfare reform in the United Kingdom. Now, a lot of disabled people still depend on welfare benefits, and therefore that has really hit them harder than almost anything. COVID has hit disabled people hard, not only because many disabled people are older or have compromised immune systems and are more at risk of COVID, but also because COVID, the shutdown, really negatively affected disabled people. And you can think of this, guide dogs, they're not able to socially distance. People with intellectual disability, what do they do all day? Well, they go to projects which are created and which have been all stopped during COVID. So they were stuck at home watching the telly. So, it shows that this society that we take for granted is contingent, constructed, and if it's taken away, it can create a huge number of barriers and difficulties for people.
Thank you. Tom, I always ask people to give out some details at the end of an interview. So if people want to find out more about your work or follow you on Twitter, are you happy to give out some?
Sure, absolutely. So if you don't know anything about disability, read my book, Disability, The Basics, because it is what it says on the packet. It's very straightforward. It should be in the library. If you really want to get to grips with it, read something like Disability Rights and Wrongs or the Disability Reader, both of which will give you more extensive information. If you want to follow me on Twitter, it's at Tommy Shakes. So it's one word, Tommy Shakes. A friend of mine used to sing Tommy Shakes. I'm not called Tommy. Nobody calls me Tommy. But on Twitter, I'm Tommy Shakes. My website is called farmerofthoughts.co.uk. So farmer of thoughts, all one word, .co.uk. And that's a quotation from Tom Paine, who was a radical, who believed in democracy, who believed in freedom. And he said, I want to be a farmer of thoughts, and all the crops I raise, I give away. And that's very much what I think a public intellectual should be about these days in any country.
Well, Tom, thank you very much for the details. Thank you very much for your time, and also for your sterling work throughout the years. And I think future students will continue to enjoy learning all about your research.
It's a wonderful way of thinking about sociology, is start with disability. That's my advice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again for your time. Bye now.